It's a pretty well-known fact that when you're writing for a college-level audience, you're often expected to use sources to help you make your point or argument stronger. However, incorporating sources can cause all sorts of trouble for students who don't have a lot of experience doing it, and one of the main issues that students face is deciding whether they should be quoting, summarizing, or paraphrasing, not to mention figuring out what the differences between those things are. So this video is going to go quickly through the main elements behind these ways of using sources and give a few examples to illustrate the differences. First up, we've got quoting. You generally use a quote when the wording of the information from the source you're using is important and you want to convey exactly what the source is saying as well as how it's saying it to your audience. So quoting is when you take words from an outside source and incorporate them into your own writing exactly as they appear in the outside source. You're taking the information word for word from the source and placing it into your own writing. Typically, you might be quoting as little as a single word or as much as a larger paragraph, or anything in between. When you quote, you'll use quotation marks to signify where the word-for-word material starts and where it ends within the context of your own paragraph. Now, it looks a little different when you're quoting a larger section out of your source. Instead, you do a little indentation move called blocking the quote rather than using actual quote marks, but that's a subject for a different video. The majority of the time that you're quoting from an outside source, you're probably going to be using quotation marks. And here's what quotation marks look like. You've probably seen them before and you've very likely used them too. Okay, so say you want to be a paralegal and you've been assigned to write an investigative paper about the career that you want to pursue while you're here at Henry Ford College. So you go online and find a little information from a credible organization, the National Organization for Legal Assistance, aka NALA. On their website, you find some information which helps distinguish a paralegal from a lawyer. And that's material that you want in your paper. You can see in the first paragraph there's some information which helps us understand how a paralegal differs from a lawyer. Okay, so here's how you might quote that information from the NALA website in your own paper. While paralegals often work closely with lawyers and do some of the same work, it must be understood that paralegals are not lawyers. As is described on the website for the National Association for Legal Assistance, quote, in communications with clients and the public, the paralegal's non-lawyer status must be clear. Paralegals cannot give legal advice or perform any duties specifically reserved for licensed attorneys, end quote. So if you look back at the source information on the left, you can see that the quote in the student sample is taken word for word from the top paragraph there. Anything that is taken from a source and put in between quote marks must be word for word. If you are leaving some words out in the middle of a quote, you can put an ellipsis in to stand in for those missing words. An ellipsis is that little ... you see sometimes in writing. Those dots stand for the words that were omitted, or in other words, left out. However, you can't change the words in any way or change the order in which they appear. You'll also notice how in this sample, the sentence that the quote is in does not start with the quote. The quote is introduced. You always want to introduce your quotes and avoid starting sentences with quotes. Okay, so now we're going to move on to summary. If you've ever written a book report for a class sometime in your life, you've probably written a summary. But here's a little more information so you can have an even better grasp on summary as a genre. Quoting was taking information from an outside source and copying it word for word in your own writing with quotation marks. Summary is the opposite. You're taking information from an outside source and putting that information in your own words. When you're writing a summary, you're condensing the information from the original source, and you do that the most effectively by highlighting the most important ideas and concepts from the original text. Summary is a matter of prioritization. What do you need your reader to know about this source without them actually reading it? Just what they need to know for your purposes is what makes it into your summary. Summaries generally take longer text and condense the information so it's significantly shorter. You can sum up an entire book in one sentence, for instance, or a 20-page article into a paragraph. But generally, you're taking a longer text and transferring the main points to your reader in a much shorter format. In a summary, there's no need for quote marks so long as you're using your own words. There is still a need for citation, however, just as you'd have for a quote. It's not just the exact wording that requires citation, but also ideas. So make sure you brush up on your MLA or APA or whatever documentation style you're using and get your citations in there. Okay, so here's an example of an original text that can be summarized. Yep, the movie Frozen. If there are young people in your life, or even if there aren't, you're probably somewhat familiar with this movie. However, if you aren't familiar with the movie, Disney has got you covered with a summary of the film, which is featured on their website. Fearless optimist Anna sets off on an epic journey, teaming up with rugged mountain man Kristoff and his loyal reindeer Sven to find her sister Elsa, whose icy powers have trapped the kingdom of Arendelle in eternal winter. Encountering Everest-like conditions, mystical trolls, and a hilarious snowman named Olaf, Anna and Kristoff battle the elements in a race to save the kingdom. And we see that's from Disney's official website. Somebody who works for Disney was able to watch the entire 1 hour and 42-minute movie and condense the very most basic and important points of the movie into 2 sentences. Obviously, there is so much more to the plot, but if you want to know more about what happens, you watch the actual movie itself. This little blurb is just a summary to get potential viewers interested and perhaps lure them into renting or buying it to see what all the kids were obsessed with back in 2013. But here we have a more sophisticated college-appropriate example of a summary. We've got a scholarly article here entitled Modern Family, Parental Leave and Marital Stability. As we can see, this article was published in 2018 in American Economic Journal. And we can also see at the bottom there that, if my math is correct, it's 24 pages long. Now, the majority of articles that are published in academic journals begin with something called an abstract. Abstracts are super useful when you're researching because it's a quick summary, which you can read in just a few seconds, and it tells you whether the article is worth your time to read in its entirety or not. So here's the abstract of the article, which was provided at the beginning. This is a 4-sentence summary, so it condenses the most important points of the 24-page article into a short paragraph. From the abstract, you get a quick sense of the problem that the researchers were interested in looking into, an idea of their methodology, and then a quick statement about their conclusions. An abstract is a summary because it's taking a pretty big source and squeezing it down to a much smaller version of itself. And again, abstracts can be super useful when you're researching, so look out for them. All right, the last way of incorporating sources that we're going to look at is paraphrase. Paraphrasing and summarizing are similar, but are used in different contexts and for different goals. When paraphrasing, you're also putting information from an outside source into your own words, just like you would when summarizing. However, when paraphrasing, you're typically taking a shorter text and turning it into something that is about the same length as the original text, maybe just a little shorter. You should consider paraphrasing when the language of the quote or information you'd want to use from an outside source is difficult or potentially confusing to your audience, and you want to provide the main concept of the quote, but in simpler, easier to understand language. Like summary, you don't need quotation marks, but again, you still need citation because you're taking the ideas from another writer and putting them into your own writing. If you don't use a citation, even when you're putting the information in your own words, it's still plagiarism, so keep that in mind. And one little note here, though, you might actually use quote marks in a paraphrase or summary if there are unique or super important words or phrases that are included in the original text that you feel need to be included in your paraphrase or summary. In that case, just put quote marks around those unique or important words or phrases, but not around your entire rendition of the source information. So let's get to an example of paraphrase. I found an academic article on, of all things, the TV show Friends, which my students tell me is making a comeback right now for some reason. So the academic journal American Speech published this essay in 2010 by a scholar named Teresa Hayde, and it's called How You Guys Doing? Stage Reality and Emerging Plural Address in the Television Series Friends. It's pretty fancy language used to talk about Friends, huh? Anything can be made into the subject of research because anything can reveal something interesting. In this case, Friends reveals staged orality and emerging plural address. Well, I know you're just dying to know what that is, so let's check it out. Okay, here's a segment of a paragraph from the research article. I'll read it to you, so follow along. However, it is by no means clear to what degree the gender bias of "you guys" is actually felt by speakers and whether it is reflected in the use of the term. Anecdotal evidence suggests that many female speakers purport that they do not feel excluded or marginalized by the use of "you guys," and that they themselves use it to address both mixed and exclusively male or female groups. Apparently, however, no empirical evidence on the use of "you guys" with regard to the gender or speaker and addressees exists to date, in part because it is difficult to determine the precise reference of an utterance when the speech situation cannot be monitored, as is usually the case with corpus data. Finally, an element of semantic bleaching may again be at work with regard to the gendered nature of the item "you guys." As Clancy has argued, the word guy is undergoing a change in that, quote, "a new generic noun is developing right before our eyes," end quote. Guys is increasingly used not only with reference to mixed groups and females, but also for inanimated or at least nonverbal agents. Whoa, okay, that was kind of intense. Maybe you got the basic idea behind this paragraph, maybe you didn't. But here's a paraphrase of this paragraph which might make it a little clearer. In discussing current usage of saying "you guys" when identifying groups of people, Haid makes the point that most people do not necessarily have a clear male gender association with the phrase. She argues that anecdotal evidence shows that females are generally comfortable using "you guys" as well as being addressed with it. However, Haid also points out that there is currently no empirical evidence or data to prove this. Haid concludes by indicating that "you guys" can also pertain to inanimated or at least nonverbal agents as well. So apparently in this paper, Haid makes the argument that Friends helped popularize a phrase that is common today, "you guys," and which is used widely to refer to all genders, even though guys started off as referring to males. It's an example of how language naturally morphs and changes over time. In this paraphrase, you can see that the same points are made as in the original text and in the same order, but that they are put into different, perhaps more simple words. However, in the last sentence of the paraphrase, you'll see some quote marks there. This indicates where some unique language of the original text was kept in the paraphrase. So that's it. Let's do a quick recap of these three concepts. First, we have the quote, which is word for word from the original text and uses quote marks. Second, we have summary, which is put into your own words and is much shorter than the original text. And last, we've got paraphrase, which is also in your own words, but is roughly the same length as the original text that maybe you would have quoted, but wanted to simplify for your audience. And in all three of these uses of sources, make sure you cite your source using the appropriate formatting according to whatever style guide you've been assigned. All right, now you know the difference between quoting, summarizing, and paraphrasing. If you've got further questions or need some clarification, ask your instructor or schedule an appointment with Henry Ford's Writing Center. There's a link to do that on your HFC Online page. Good luck!